Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones. The unvisited ones. The cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome to the show Ryan Edward. Ryan is an artist, designer, and deck creator. In fact, he is responsible for one of my favourite Lenormand decks, the Maybe Lenormand. He joins us today to talk through the process of deck creation, how design informs fortune-telling function, the story of the Lenormand cards through time, the difference between divination and fortune-telling, and also what it was like growing up in a funeral home. Enjoy. Ryan, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, nice one. I've been looking forward to this discussion for a little while because it's about one of my favorite things. However, and before we get to it, you're a first-time guest. You get the first-time question. Ryan, were you a weird kid?
I was waiting for this. Yeah, absolutely, definitely. I think all kids are a little weird, but I would say I was exceptionally weird. I think part of that's maybe just due to circumstance. Being in the rural Bible Belt of the Midwest, it's super conservative, so it's a very low threshold for being weird, right? Very old, farmer family. We have one of the oldest homesteads in the whole state of Illinois. Like we're really rooted in that way. So anything that's different is really seen as really weird and exceptionally so. And being queer on top of that definitely added a lot of spice to the weirdness. And then even like as far as this past year, we found out I am technically on the autism spectrum in my late 30s. So like, just lots of bits of weird.
Kid.
Right. Yeah. And I embrace that. I enjoy that even till today. But no, to give very baseline examples, I was super obsessed with mermaids as a kid, which then brought me into really being fascinated with Greek mythology. I would study any language I could, but not really get too far. So then I'd hop over to the other language. But just lots of eccentricities, if you will. But then just the fact that old rural family didn't help, and it kind of made me feel weirder, but then also traditions in that family kind of added to my weirdness. But then my mom, even on top of that, I don't want to blame her, but when we were 9, we moved into an active funeral home.
Okay.
Which I lived in until I was in college. So there was always just these weird external factors, I feel like, that made a weird kid even weirder, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a real 6 feet under situation. Very cool.
A little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Because usually when I ask that or do a follow-up question, if you're from an old family with an old farmhouse, I was going to say, did you live in a haunted house or something? And then I'm like, well, you lived in a funeral home too. So,
yes.
So any ghost stories from the childhood?
Not too much. I lived alone. I had mom. She was a single mom. She worked a while away. I was the youngest, so my brother and sister were out of the house. So I spent a lot of time in the house by myself, I should say. And living in the funeral home, we lived on the second floor. Yeah, very 6 feet under. But there was just lots of times I'd be at home and I would hear there's the cricks and whatever of an old home, but boxes falling, clearing of throats, little one-off sounds, nothing visual per se, but a couple things to make a 9 or 12-year-old kid kind of think twice about going down the hallway or something, for sure.
Interesting. I want to come back to the mermaids thing. Have you like thought as to why that was? I mean, do you have, here's a different way of saying that. Like how early were you, how young were you when, did you have a memory of not being obsessed with mermaids as a kid? Was it something that happened when you were like 3 or 4 kind of situation? Or do you remember encountering them and going like, hey, these appear to be my jam for some reason?
Yeah, it was around the age probably 4 or 5-ish. It might have honestly been just simply Daryl Hannah and Splash. I honestly don't know. I think that was definitely my first eyes on a mermaid, and just being really fascinated about someone who looks like me, but wasn't me. And there's this whole like juxtaposition of sea and earth and land, that I just was really captivated by.
Yeah, totally.
And then like when I was in kindergarten, I think is when Disney's Little Mermaid came out. So then it just became, super saturated at that time. But I remember even before, that came out, I would draw all the women in my life as mermaids. So my mom, my sister, my kindergarten teacher, just kind of swim in the ocean. They would be wearing a dress that was sitting above the water because it was floating. And I don't know. Very weird kid. And
I like that because there's like an invitation to see that from almost like a Jungian perspective, that like these are the sirens leading you to like eventually things like mythology and fortune telling and so on. So at an early age, you're like being led away by these alluring and deceptive voices, and it's fun to kind of go, oh yeah, the mermaids kind of picked you and took you off as a kid.
Yeah, which an evangelical mom was very sensitive to at the time.
So that you mentioned the drawing thing, right? I kind of know this, but it's sort of interesting. The art obviously came first, but when it comes to like art and say deck creation, right? But do you have a memory of the first time, again, if this is the context you grew up in? And I had a friend of mine, Joanna, on the show recently, who we talk about this. I have a memory of the first time I encountered tarot cards as a small kid. Do you have a memory of the first time, especially with that sort of context, that you knew something like tarot existed?
Not at that age. It was probably middle school, and that was purely because I was in the middle school in the 90s and Miss Cleo was on TV. So she was very much my introduction into what are these things. Super short answer, it was her in mainstream culture. I wish I gave you a more arcane and obtuse story, but yes.
Well, like, when did you acquire a set when you were in high school? I mean, because again, there's that extra step if you're already standing out somewhat in your family and context. Did you decide to go, fuck it, I'm also going to get some cards?
No, I was probably too scared at that time. Again, very evangelical family. I remember even at church camp in the summer, like the first day we got there, we had heard like some kid in the next cabin just got his tarot deck confiscated, like when we were unpacking. So they were very, forbidden fruit. So didn't go near them. The closest thing I came to was like the horoscopes in the back of the TV guide. It wasn't until I was honest, like 10 years ago, I picked up my first tarot deck for myself as an illustration project. So they were always in the world. I had my cards read a couple times by kids in college, with Waite Smith deck, of course. And then had my future read, fortune told, or however you want to put it, by a couple of readers in my early 20s, which made me like revisit, because I always thought they were fascinating, but they were just something I was leery of as a kid from my upbringing.
Gotcha. So when you say you picked up a deck for an art project, was it Did you decide at some stage, I'm going to make a card set, or did you see something that appealed to you and pick that one up and then sat with it and gone, you know what, I could probably do this? I mean, how did that work?
So I essentially picked up a deck knowing that I wanted to create a deck of cards. So yeah, the idea actually came first. And it was essentially just because I wanted to do an illustration project. I was working as an art director and like advertising and marketing. My degree was in design/illustration. So I really wanted to get back to just that illustrative part and just not just getting a sandbox play area to draw pictures, but also reconnect those wires of interpreting images into words and words into images outside of like my day-to-day, which was to, sell beer and other things, in my day job. So it was really just a desire to do something that was super illustrative. And I thought a tarot deck at that time, which was my initial purchase, was a good platform for that. It was something that had a structure. It was something that had some foundation, but then I could reinterpret it as myself. And this was about 2010, 2011. So it was kind of like on the cusp of, I would say, the more modern fad of, the super saturation of cards and everything now today. But at least in the illustrator designer sphere, it was something that was new to explore.
Sure. Did you at the time know the difference between like a Waite Smith and a Marseille, and did you make like a creative decision at that point, I'm going to go with this one or that one, or did you start Waite Smith and end up Marseille? Like, how did that go?
Marseille was not necessarily on my radar. If I were to Google tarot, some of those cards would pop up and I would just immediately identify those as like, yeah, those are the older cards. But the first purchase was a Waite Smith. They were the cards, that I recognized. Immediately grabbed it off the shelf as soon as I saw that yellow box. I looked around at Barnes & Noble, and then just immediately knew that was like the staple. That was almost instinctual at that point. So that's what I started and learned with, but then kind of pivoted quickly along the way.
And what was it that led to the pivot?
Just really going down the rabbit hole. So I'm like to be well researched in any project that I do, and this was no exception. So for me to understand the Waite Smith, I felt like I needed to understand the Golden Dawn. To understand the Golden Dawn's approach, I felt like I needed to know Papou and Taya and the French techniques. And then I started to realize how those were commonalities. And then this was all again, so this was around 2011, 2012. And this was right around the time Lenormand was coming into the forefront. So then it was kind of like, well, what are these cards? Let me, investigate. So then it kind of went down that path. But yeah, I found, long story short, I found stuff that I connected with or stuff that I was more excited by in the old, more quote unquote fortune telling versions of these decks versus the more occult, esoteric layovers of them with the Waite Smith, which I think Waite Smith is that nice sweet spot in between fortune telling and esoteric occult for many reasons. But it was really just going down the rabbit holes and really following what excited me along the way.
No, totally. Well, it's funny. One of the next questions is you kind of hit on a little bit, which is fortune telling or divination, and why? Which one do you use, or how do you think with those ideas?
Oh, I always default to fortune telling. I know that's been a charged word, so to speak. And I think it's also been a pendulum that has swung back and forth. To me, the word itself does not inherently hold any baggage. I feel like we have put baggage into that term. To tell someone's fortune is to tell, fortune in itself is a pretty broad term. So to me, to tell fortunes is not anything that divination is not. I mean, you could say, speaking with God, speaking with the divine, but to me, it all comes out the same in the wash. I guess, but I default to fortune telling. To me, it's a more simpler, cleaner, more understood approach.
It's also, in that very Camellia sense, right, exactly what you're doing. It doesn't,
right.
It just describes you are telling a story, and fortune is, if you look at what that goddess is, right, like it's the good and the bad, it's a tale, right? And I like it because that's literally the session. It's you're not making, and you can have these if you want, but you're not making truth claims about, oracular contact with the divine or anything.
Right.
You're like, and it has that that continental feel still, right? That kind of Harlequin-esque performative, in a real sense, performative, not in a faked sense, right? So I like the word. I think I'm not sure. I think maybe it is charged for that reason, but I get what you mean. Like, it's been historically charged because we have pointed at people, gypsies, whatever, who do these kinds of things and said they're a fortune teller as a pejorative. But there's kind of like a fun reclamation of that, I think, to be like, no,
exactly.
Fortune telling, that's exactly what we're doing.
Precisely.
Nice one. So you can we have a write-in question coming back to the idea of design, and you can probably guess who it's from. I'm not going to do the accent though, Ryan.
I already know.
Ask him what he thinks of light in cartomancy and design. Hint, I don't want to hear any lame talk about the shadow.
Talk about light in cartomancy and design?
Yes.
All right. Interesting. I'm not surprised by this question, but I'm thinking on it for a second. This may not be where they're going, and by they, I can assume
it's Camellia. We can just
asking this question. Yes, okay. For the reader's sake, to me, it's light and design is about the balance of simplicity. So, the white space, so to speak, is something that we would say in like pure 101 graphic design terms, right? Like, how do you have the content and the density that you need to have a message or to have components to constitute a design, but also how do you have that space to let that have focus and let that to take agency and forefront. This is how I'm interpreting the question, interpreting my answer for it, so to speak. And I think how that plays into divination and cards and card making and designing cards for the sake of card making, is also just making sure that you're putting enough onto those cards, but nothing more. Where it's not necessarily like minimalism, but it's essentialism in that case, where you're dialing, you push and you pull and you push and you pull until you get to that really nice spot where it's just enough. And in Lenormand, I think this is like super, case in point, just like when you look at the tableau and how busy are the cards, and are they too busy that you can't read the tableau easily because there's not enough space to breathe to get focus to what is. So that's my roundabout ramble way of answering that. But
no, I like it. It's good because you can, I can turn this into a question, right? In the process of making the Maybe Lenormand, presumably you went through a similar process of a deep dive and so on. You can buy a bunch of decks and some of them look lovely. Some of them is a nice, a nice pack of illustrations, but there's more confidence from a fortune teller's perspective in yours down to the size of the cards and what we were just talking about there, which is these need to be used. And some of them are beautiful and ornate, but as you say, you tableau them out and you go, it's like looking at, I don't know what I'm looking at here. Is this a bad acid trip? What's happening, right? And it's and I think that Did you find that in the course of your process that some of them were just simply too busy? Is that part of what I think Camellia is getting at there?
Yeah, absolutely. And thankfully, that wasn't a unique thought. You know, there were many people that would rate decks based on how busy they were. It would still be interesting because some very what I would consider busy decks were still considered popular. But I, yeah, it was to the forefront. Just it was, yeah, not a alien thought. And also, it was in my own experience and my own ability to read and ability to focus. One of my favorite decks, which was a gift to Camellia, but also is a very historical deck in the context of Lenormand or Lenormand. I'll use those words interchangeably or pronunciations, but is a deck that is super simple. And she had gifted me a facsimile, and that immediately became my favorite deck because it is that what I will call that type 1 style of Lenormand, which is just that clean white background, an emblem on it. There may be a turf of grass or something like that, but there is no scenic picture to describe it. It's what the initial, Game of Hope was designed like. This other deck that Camila gave me, also the Leipzig, or it's also called the Gluck in its reproductions. But there's that whole early stage of Lenormand where they're all the same, and they were that designed that way for that reason. I can only imagine.
Yeah. Well, that's actually maybe we start there for the listeners. It's a weird place we're a third of the way in. What's the Lenormand, Brian?
Yeah, so the Lenormand, as we understand it or describe it today, is a pack of 36 cards that are, each one is associated with a playing card, and each card has a number 1 through 36, and each card main illustration is just a simple emblem of a day-to-day object, a house, a ship, a key, a book. And it has remained incredibly consistent over the past couple hundred years. It started out, like most divination systems, as a game, quote unquote, the Game of Hope, Das Spiel des crap, German, but the Game of Hope, and which actually was more like a shoots and ladders game. You would lay out the cards 1 through 36 in a board, just in numerical order, and there were inherently, positive, negative cards that moved you forward so many spaces or moved you back so many spaces.
Yeah,
And the object of the game.
It's not exactly Fortnite, is it? It's so boring. Like, I was so disappointed when I found out that's what it was.
And yeah, the whole object of the game was to land on the anchor, card 35, which symbolizes hope, and not on card 36, which was the cross. And if you landed on the cross, it was kind of like, sorry, you had to go back so many steps, and the game was to land on the anchor. There are a lot of commonalities between it and tea leaf reading or coffee ground reading. And that was observed just because these symbols, key, book, dog, or things that you regularly see in a tea leaving book or coffee reading book or instructions. And they later found on earlier than the Game of Hope was, like, Game of Hope, I think, came from 1799, 1800. Around 1796, there was a deck of cards actually from England, which are just now dubbed like the coffee cards. I think there's a more formal name to them. Mary Greer discovered them essentially through the British Museum's website archives. But it's a very similar set, not exactly 36, 32 cards, and I think 80, 90% of them are the same symbols. But yeah, and it describes them in the context of coffee ground readings. So they are these, super quote unquote fortune telly symbols and emblems that really direct back to tea leaf reading, coffee ground reading. And that's how we also get things like their different reading styles with near and far and how clouded something is. Now I'm going off on a weird tangent.
No, that's
and
good.
getting
That's
really deep,
because,
really
like,
getting deep here.
well,
But
because that helps situate
yes,
the cards in a specific fortune telling context, right? So that the images that are on them would have been very recognizable to people in the late 18th, early 19th century who would be familiar with tea leaf reading in the parlor, like even as a fun afternoon game, right?
right, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, do these cards have anything to do with Madame Lenormand herself, and who was she?
Um, No, short answer. As far as we know, absolutely not. There is a couple years of crossover in her life and when these cards started to come out. But it's most understood, just like tarot and coming from Egypt. No, that's part of the myth. And someone described this, which I really like. It's almost like if you were to buy a magic kit and someone marketed as the Harry Houdini magic kit, right? And you just buy it because it has his name on it and you associate Harry Houdini with magic and blah, blah, blah. And it's the same situation. She was a notable woman, and I don't want to discount the connection by discounting her. French, essentially fortune teller, in the late 1700s. She was a confidant to, I'm drawing blank on the name, Napoleon's Empress Josephine, excuse me, was allegedly her, she consulted her and allegedly read for Napoleon, potentially read for his demise, and he ignored it, and all of that. So she definitely had a name. She capitalized on her name. She was even arrested for her fortune telling on occasions. And when she would do it, you would have to go to, I believe, like a library or bookstore, and then you had to make the special request to where they would let you into the back room. And she was one for pageantry and theatrics, or at least the descriptions would describe her as such. So you go into this room that maybe had bats on the wall and all these occult symbols, and she sit you down and read your cards. The descriptions of the cards vary in the stories. Someone describing them as tarot cards. We're not sure if they're just using that term broadly or if they were probably more likely playing cards. There were some stories that would suggest she wanted a Taya decks because those were out in her time, but they were too pricey for her until she became more rich and notable from her. So she actually did gain some wealth from her fortune telling. And that, again, I'm not a historian, so that's my kind of pedestrian take or understanding or retelling of her a little bit. But
it's cool. Like she definitely had playing cards, and I would speculate by the end she had an Atea deck, even a modified one or something. Like you'd be able to like whip your own up, but I'm quite sure she had her own cards in that sense, right? Some sort of modded deck, because the descriptions of it, this is where I like the overlap with the Lenormand deck as we understand it. She did do, like, there were such things as Lenormand tableaus, but that's because that was her name. So there's this funny, again, fortune telling crossover where the Lenormand cards that we have that have nothing to do with her have insets that are playing cards, which is in fact, what she would principally use. So it's this kind of fun weaving sort of blend to it.
Yeah, it makes the story much more plausible to someone on first blush, of course. And especially, I mean, maybe we need to even delineate Petite Lenormand from, there's also the Grand Lenormand, which is a 52 card deck, which also has insets, but is outside of the name, has no relation. It has Greek mythology and flower myths and alchemy symbols on it. It's much more innate, but there's actually written stories that refer to her telling fortunes that clearly reference the illustrations in those decks. But then again, right, is that just someone that, because this deck, which was also out by Gourmand at this time, who was publishing the Atea decks around that time, were they just like picking up that deck and then using that as, catalyst or, a nugget of their story?
Yeah.
Right?
I like it better that, one, that we don't know, and two, that it is, scam's the wrong word, scam's too strong, but it's part of the excitement and the fortune telling again, like the unreliability of the performance is kind of baked into the story of the cards. And I like that. It's the sort of countercurrent to the sort of Atea Papu thing of everything with its precise delineated meaning coming down in an orderly fashion from Egypt that can be corrected by their powerful esoteric knowledge. I like that the genuine fortune telling current is filled with like shadowy claims and counterclaims, because that's just better for a process like this.
And I love that it's also like, and that's to me where it starts and stops too, right? And just in the background, what I love so much about Lenormand decks is because it has had a consistent instruction sheet, so to speak, for the most of its lifespan. So while the tarot has both had, this sordid story of both its origin and what it means, for Lenormand, it's just the background story, which is more in question. The fact that essentially since it's been publicized or published, it's had consistent meanings and consistent instructions, which has kind of carried it along surprisingly more consistently. It's been able to give it keep it grounded, so to speak.
It's managed to resist. I was talking to a friend of mine, Austin Kopic, last night about this call, and this is going to move into a question in a second, but it's managed to resist that esoteric accretion, and in many ways that's sort of surprising, right? And this is why I was talking to Austin about it, because 36 is of course the number of decans, so I'm sure someone has been very tempted.
Yes. It's already happened.
Yeah. To give it the whole weight treatment, I guess, or Atea treatment, whatever you want to call it, but it resists it because from the very beginning it's like, listen, this is a game. And it has like a bear and like some things that are quite frivolous, and like very few of these things have the esoteric meaning that you think they do. It says it's a game, and here's its rules, and here's what these things. Here's the performance of the game, and as you say, we've had that for now 230 years, and it does give it something of a structure. But so the 36 doesn't mean anything other than that's how many quote unquote playing piece cards, if you want, on in the original game. It doesn't have an esoteric meaning, which is good, because I want to ask you how, like, talk us through the process of, so the Maybe Lenormand is called that because it's a 52 Lenormand rather than a 36. So talk us through that decision, and I'll tell you my backstory once you've done it. And what did you use for the sort of Jurassic Park frog DNA to get from 36 to 52 in your deck?
So I think it's maybe as we talk about the history and the origins, it is 36 because at that time in Germany, that was the typical game they played with, was 36 cards, Jazz or Yaz, Jass, just like we would see in the French decks at that time. The Petite Atea and some of those other oracles were 32 because they played a game called Piquet, which was 32 cards. So that's essentially why we got to 36 and why Lenormand is the way it is. For me, why I really craved the 52 were twofold. It was because I was studying under Camellia at this time. So playing cards were very much at the forefront. We started with Lenormand, but then went into playing cards, and then like, okay, let's dig into the Marseille. But all of those I still use the same core structure, which is playing cards, or I still approach them in similar ways. So there was just that craving for a full 52 card deck. There was also actually threefold. There were times when I was laying out cards and noticing, whatever, I have 4 kings. What are the odds of that? And that's just something like, if you were playing poker and I had 5 cards and 4 of them were kings, that's a big deal. But then I had to remember that, well, wait a second, there's no, 2 through 5 of this deck, so that changes the odds. So I wanted to kind of rebalance just the recognition of those probabilities happening. But then also, some of my favorite quote unquote Lenormands aren't what may constitute as an official Lenormand. Camila will call them Lenormands. Other people will call them Lenoracles. So these are things like the Gypsy Witch, or my favorite deck, which is the Whitmans, which is a children's brand, old Gypsy fortune-telling cards. So there was this other like tangential lineage of cards that were very much Lenormand. They had maybe a playing card or a different glyph. They maybe had a verse. They had near and far meanings. You read them in tableaus. They had star and moon and rider. But they had a different DNA to them. They usually, the sun and the moon were cards 1 and 2. And it always ended with the last card, whether it be 36 or 52, would be the safe card. And so, yeah, these are colloquially known as Gypsy cards. And I loved them a lot. And they were charming. They gave me some meanings that I couldn't give them Lenormand, and they also alleviated other meanings that maybe some cards held more baggage in them in Lenormand. So it was all those things that made me really want to have a Lenormand, but have this option for something else. Because there is the case, like in the Gypsy Witch, it essentially is a Lenormand, but like all the card sets are mixed up, all the new, the numbers are all mixed up. So I wanted the deck that, cards 1 through 36 is your Lenormand as you understand it. The insets, the numbers, the glyphs, they all match up. But then you have this extra set that you could pull in because you want a full deck, because you want those extra cards that some people like. It just gave you that option. So, yeah.
So I struggled for years with the Lenormand because for kind of like a similar reason there, it was an incomplete card deck. So I struggled with trying to work out things like the insets, like, because I wasn't sure what we were missing and so on. It's interesting, like I know how I can read with the Naipes deck. So there are, if you're used to it in your head, if you're in Europe or France or even Spain or wherever now, if you're used to these sort of limited card deck games, you kind of know in the back of your mind, this suit stops at 7. So you have the ability to kind of calculate something like odds, as you were discussing, right? So I struggled with Lenormand for that reason, but I loved the Sibylla deck, which they're Lenoracles, right? Like all these kind of, I like Sibylla ones because it's a full deck. The images aren't as useful from a fortune-telling perspective and are quite hilariously sexist and whatever, like angry woman.
They're so dramatic.
I know, and like brigands will attack you and what have you. But I couldn't understand why I could get those to sing. And I struggled with Lenormand. And it was because in Camelia's course, she recommends your deck specifically, which is how I found it, right? And I'm like, this is the way in, because it's I managed to kind of go from, because I know how to do playing cards, and Lenormand was kind of like too far with its inset incompleteness, and this is the right kind of blend to move forward. So I could go Sibylla, maybe Lenormand, and now I can do 36 or what have you. But it was that I didn't realize what I was waiting for was like an optionally expanded Lenormand set that kind of situates it more or constellates it with its cousins in history, I suppose. So congrats.
Right.
That was very useful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
So did you, I mean, go through the process of that for 37 to 52? Did you kind of like line up some of these gypsy decks and go, okay, well, like, was there actually, I'll start the conversation or question somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any logic to this is a leading question. Is there any logic
Yeah.
to the insets in the original 36? And consequently, was there any logic to the insets in 37 to 52 in yours?
Ooh, I love this question. So, some. Well, as far as my associations with the 16 extras, I made as close as associations that I could within those tight parameters. But I do think this brings up something great about the insets and specifically the suits in Lenormand, and how they are slightly unique, if especially compared to our regular playing cards, quote unquote, and how we interpret specifically, case in point, the suit of spades. So in most Anglo-French traditions, the suit of spades is a bad suit, it's a dark suit, it's a cutting suit, it's an occult suit. But in the Germans had a whole different set of those four suits, as many countries did. So for the Germans, they were hearts, diamonds, acorns, and leaves instead of spades. So for the Lenormand, while we see spades, it was designed with the understanding of leaves, and the leaves to the Germans were the most prosperous suit, if not one of, but it was all about growth and success. So in the Lenormand, you'll see spades that are, and that's why things that grow, like the flowers, like the lilies, like the garden, like the child,
yeah,
all are, spades, and things that also have to do with like success, like the ship, 10 of spades. So those considerations were made. So that's why you won't see in those extra cards, I don't associate. Some people have done similar takes on my approach to the deck after. So there are some other expanded Lenormand decks out there, and they have associated essentially like the two of spades with the crossed swords. And if you think through tarot, if you think there are common understandings of the two of spades, that makes sense. But for me, with the Maybe Lenormand, I use that as the handshake, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe it's the two of clubs. Yeah. So for me, that was the concept of two, but it was the concept of two with the understanding of growth. Also, so hearts obviously line up really well within Lenormand. Diamonds were more about risk and reward. So it was kind of like the highs and the lows. So that's why you would have cards like the coffin, which is not great. It's bankruptcy according to the original instructions. But also would have like the 10 of diamonds, which was the book, which is knowledge, or the king of diamonds, which is the fish, prosperity. And then acorns in Lenormand is the negative suit, because it is associated with essentially poverty and the lowest of the low. So that's where we get our negative cards in Lenormand. So when I was doing the extra cards, I made sure any negative cards I had, if I could, I made them clubs. Within the numbers of 2 through 4, I did what I could. I believe the sick bed is the 4 of clubs. 4 I associate with things that are square in cartomancy. So beds, homes, rooms, desk, things like that. And then it being the clubs, the negative suit. So the sick bed is the negative suit that is 4-sided, the sick bed.
It's awesome.
So as much as I could.
Yeah. And so I guess the process, like, this is cool, was, okay, I'm gonna note down the missing playing cards to get from 37 to 52, and then use the logic of playing cards in German, or the language rather than the logic, I guess, of playing cards in Germany, and line that up and go, okay, so this suit means that, and there are similar or other cards that say things like sickbed or lightning or what have you, and put them in that way. So it began with kind of like the insets as a frame for what you would put on the remaining cards?
Um, Back and forth. So yeah, I definitely had that matrix of what, those 4 suits and those mini cards that we had holes, but I also drew list of all the cards that I wanted to maybe include. And in my prototype, I actually made some changes. There were a couple cards that I had in the prototype, one being the crown and one being, which was a skull with a raven on top. And then I swapped those out for the lion and something else. So long story short, I took all the cards that were maybe in the contestant pool, then this, clear matrix of the holes I needed to fill, and then worked from there to fill in the gaps and keep it holistic as possible.
Yeah, I've always wanted to know that, because I figured there would be something in the logic of the creative process that made the Lenormand really bioavailable to me, and it was, the key for me was, I think, the insets. So that's really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. This is an interesting, not really a leading question, but so what do you think the key difference is between reading tarot and reading Lenormand?
Oh, it's become a loaded question over time. And and because of that, Camille would say there was no difference hardly. And yeah, I do use similar approaches across them all. For me, a couple of things that I would say, I don't know that these are like case in point in themselves, but one difference I do think is, I won't say the method of reading them, but I will say the vocabulary that they have. And also, and this kind of goes with the concept of tarot is symbolic, but Lenormand is emblematic, kind of in the idea that it's more prescribed, where symbols are vessels that receive meaning and accrue meaning, but emblems are an encapsulation of a thought or a encapsulation of a concept or some words that need to get pointed across. So I think that's a bit of a difference. The way I will explain it, to coworkers over coffee is I describe tarot as panels of a comic strip, and I look at Lenormand as emojis in a text message, whereas tarot are acting out the scenes. And yes, I try to make my Lenormand very animated, to where the cards are interacting with each other, and so to speak. But that they are these little glyphs that you formulate a sentence with, because they are more condensed meanings, more condensed concepts. I hate to say cards have meaning, because I don't think the meaning comes until you have context of the question. But they are these, they're a little bit tighter. So whereas a tarot card, you might be able to write, a 6-page essay, or God knows how much more pages on a single tarot card. You're pretty limited with Lenormand, and that keeps it more focused, if you will.
Yeah, I like the comics panel emoji difference, because I think that more or less each kind of Lenormand card has its own beginning, middle, and end, and less less of the kind of operatic movement you see, particularly if you're doing like a mages only Marseille reading, right? Because they're all it's like being on acid in a fairground. Like, you can see the whole thing coming together. But I mean, that lends itself, I think, I like your examples in the book. This is coming to the context and question and meaning thing, but because I think one of the things I love about Lenormand style fortune telling is that it's sort of modular when it comes to meanings. And the examples you have in the book allow you to kind of have, like, if it's a 5-card linear, then there's like the overall narrative in a 5-card reading of kind of like going along, reading the text message, reading the emojis, but you also get like the sub observations in 2-card pairs within that are like separate but nested stories, I think, in the overarching response. So, I mean, do you want to, what do you think to that? Is that a fair way of describing a capacity Lenormand has that I think is more easily found than in something like tarot?
More easily, yes, not exclusive though. Because I think the way you described it, you just described the Petita Tea too, which became a reference point to the Wade Smith. So the lines get blurred, but more to the forefront, with Lenormand. I think it is, and someone has said, which I really love, Lenormand's not about reading the cards, it's about reading the space in between the cards, because it is so relied heavily on those connections and those pairings and the blendings of those words. Like, no, I think today there's probably different schools of thought in Lenormand, but I think most people would say the one thing, which is you don't do 1-card Lenormand readings, and that's why. And I think it's also because, back to the tarot versus Lenormand, how do they differ? Because I feel like if you look at a tarot card or pick up a tarot card, it's already this intersection of the suit and the number and any story that is on the illustration. It's already carrying all of those different things, whereas Lenormand, it's already distilled into like a smaller concept, and you get the understandings by comparing it to the other cards around it. Not to say you don't read other cards together in tarot, but it's a little bit more deconstructed in Lenormand, which to me gives you more flexibility, and it makes the oracle more nimble. It's almost like working with a tinier set of tools to work with like something really, small and precious. It allows you to get a little bit more detailed because the tools are so much smaller.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it, because it has the whole a sequential language, as you say. It's not just you. I mean, you can do what you want with your cards, right? But typically, you don't put a single Lenormand down. But also, the sequence of them, because of this like between space capacity, is important. So if you have son and child, that's different to child and son, even though those are the 2 cards. In the same way, you can certainly lead people astray by getting your emojis in the wrong sequence.
Right. Absolutely.
So going back to this is an interesting one. I haven't asked a deck creator this yet. Do you have a memory or a story of like its best and most accurate fortune telling that you did with your own cards, and like, I did that, like it said this and then exactly this happened? Do you have in your head like the time something like that happened?
I was thinking about this actually before this call. There's a couple instances. One, I'll try to like lightning round these. One was a friend that was contemplating a move, or not sure if he was able to move or how he was going to move or where he was going to move to. But he landed in the tableau right underneath the tower, underneath the coffin. So I told him, look, looks like you're probably going to have a really small, cramped studio space and a high rise, which is exactly where he moved to. Another one, which I think is more delightful, is my partner at the time, his coworker friend, a couple of people were over, I think for like a barbecue, and she just asked me to fling the cards just for funsies, and did a tableau, and I saw her in the house of the mountain, so obstacles, but had a child above her, and believe in the house of the bouquet or surprises potentially. And I knew she did have a child. I didn't think she wanted a child, but I was just like, I don't know if you have like some babysitting coming up or, exactly. Or potentially like, I don't know, I'd say double wrap. It turned out she was already pregnant and she didn't know. So those were a couple like, kind of just like instances where it was not just making a stretch to say that prediction happened to me. That was very quote unquote on point. Yeah,
that's that must be fun when you do that with the deck you made yourself. Going, hey, look at me.
Right.
So where's a good place?
That has much to do with myself, right? It's just these cards are so cards are so simple and so consistent like that.
Well, so that's a good sort of like final sort of almost like a tip maybe for people who where would people who are coming from, and this is also contentious, but I think we're on the same page with it. Where would people coming from an understanding of tarot that is very meaning centric begin if they're like, oh, Lenormand, I'm going to give this a shot? Do you have any tips about like, okay, so if you're, what would people do if they've never played with Lenormand before? As what would you suggest to people coming from that background in particular, not coming cold? Because in many respects, I think it's easier if you're coming cold to the concept of fortune telling, just be like, oh, look, it's just 5 cards and kind of read it like an emoji. Do you have tips for people who have maybe been, I don't want to say damaged by a meaning centric approach, but maybe are more familiar with that?
That can be hard. I would just stress that, cards have no meaning until you have context or question, that a card has many facets, and I think everybody will agree to that. But you need the context of the question to decide which way to turn that card to reveal which facet makes sense in conjunction with the other cards, in conjunction with the context, and does it answer the question? I would also say, look at your source material. If that person is reading a Thoth deck or a Waite Smith deck, look at the Book of Thoth. I know it's super obtuse, but there's examples that Crowley gives that seem very much like the Lenormand comparisons. If you look at the Key to Tarot by Waite, like there's a whole glossary in the back that really like, hey, did you also know that the Page of Wands, while there's these other psychological and personality-based meanings for the Page of Wands, it also means a postman. So look back at those source materials. I think we've just so focused on the more I don't want to say fluffy stuff, but the more grandiose concepts.
Grandiose is better.
That you lose sight of some of these really practical nuggets that have been there all along.
I think the if you look at the Trumps, right, you've got like a Pope and the devil and like, all this stuff going on. And although we don't typically have sailing ships and whatever in our day-to-day life, it's much more quotidian. So I think it's actually quite good. It's very difficult, and you're going to want to do it. Like you see the moon, and first of all, phenomenologically, it's just the moon to start with, and then depending on it, it might mean reputation or whatever, but it need not. And I think what I like about the Lenormand is that it makes it more difficult for you to slip into those bad habits of going straight to the grandiose meanings, because it's just like, it's a flower, right? Or a garden. And you don't have to go, Garden of Eden, or whatever right away. Like it's a garden. And that's one of the things that it's accidentally doing to you when you encounter them, I think, is unlearn some of those habits.
Yeah, and I think, and I've seen some people take those approaches, and someone has said, which I resonate with too, is like there's a difference between reading the Lenormand cards and reading the Lenormand system. So anybody can take any deck of pictures and use it as an oracle, right? And you can go down those paths, but there is just having this understanding of the intent and the design of it, right? Because I think that's what's so beautiful that it is a piece of design outside of just these are designed images. There is intent in the construct of it.
Yeah. So it's a related question, but a similar one. I would almost be tempted to say, maybe I'm going to say this, that you would, if you're coming from a very meaning-based, I'm going to keep the explanatory book beside me as I do my tarot cards kind of approach. I'm almost tempted to say to people, go straight to like larger tableaus, do a grand tableau to start with, because because you actually see the system working, and that will come to the fore rather than trying to fall into the bad habits of diving into the meaning of tower and moon and whatever, because you're looking at the system in play.
Yeah, and I think I'm so glad you said that too, because it highlights another key aspect of Lenormand, which is it's all about relation. So it's not necessarily always about like what cards fell and maybe even what order they came in, but like, are you above or below? How far are you? Is it close to you? It's how do these things, where do the dots connect and where do the lines meet? And it is more about the relations. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, no, cool stuff. Well, Ryan, I was looking forward to this. I like talking about Lenormand, and because I like playing with Lenormand, and I have in fact been doing so with your own
wonderful
Lenormand because we've been talking. But on that note, where can people get said cards if they're ready to make the jump?
Yeah, absolutely. I point most people to Amazon. Both my Maybe Lenormand and the Plain Marseille are both published by US Games. So they're pretty widely distributed, Amazon, Book Depository, things like that. I did have a limited edition of the Maybe Lenormand available. I've gone on hiatus over the past year or two, done some moves and some life transitions. So those will come back on sale eventually. So I've essentially took down my website, but I've pointed the URL.
You were very difficult to find. It's weird. Like when I first got the cards, I'm like, oh, I'll have Ryan on at some stage. And then
that's by design, actually.
Yeah.
I had a website for a while, and then I just it was a hobby that became something to have anxiety and stress about. So I wanted to as Camila would say, practice detachment. But I did recently, actually, just before this call, I've pointed my old URL to my newsletter sign up. So if you still go to inset.cards, CARDS, it's a really short URL, but it'll point you to if you want it, put in your email, and I will let you know when the Maybe Lenormand limited edition, and this is when I say limited edition, it is done on watercolor stock. It is hand painted, hand colored, comes in a wooden box. So it was part of the exercise of making a Lenormand that also was produced like an old Lenormand.
Nice.
It's a higher price point. But it would, I'll make that more available through then, or if I have a couple other projects, which I'm noodling on, but who knows, I'll let you know there. Good thing is I hardly forget or hardly remember that I have that account or MailChimp. So the last thing I think I've sent to email is 2018. So I'm not going to spam you too much. So that's the plus side. So also, if you're on Instagram at Ryan of Spades, I don't post a lot of card stuff there, just kind of like my day-to-day life, but sometimes cards pop into the picture. So
nice one.
Yeah.
Well, sir, thank you very much. Good chat. And for people listening, this will, of course, all be in the show notes. But thanks for your time.
No, thank you so much.